All right. Good afternoon. Thanks for coming already. I have the honor to introduce to you, first to my left, to your right, Andy Müller-Maguhn, a almost founding member of the Chaos Computer Club. I know him since the 1980s when he was 16. He not only the Chaos Computer Club, but mainly the Wow Stiftung, started to support Julian Assange and WikiLeaks at a very early point. And basically, they stepped in when the American big credit card companies and banks boycotted WikiLeaks. And Wow Stiftung is now collecting money, donations for the defense of Julian Assange. Now, to my right, and your left, I really warmly welcome Stella Assange, who flew in from London this morning. And just to give you a report how the complicated and complex legal procedure against her husband, what's the state of them. And we're going to get some information. For 45 minutes, around, and then you are heartily invited to ask questions. So, just maybe I should mention, Stella is a human rights lawyer, born in South Africa with Swedish and Catalonian roots, and she is a member of the legal team of the big team, international team of lawyers for Julian since 2011. You're married since 2022, if I got that right. And I have to confess, Stella is a very brave woman, sorry to say that. And not only Stella, but the small group of WikiLeaks people, the way they fight against the extradition of Julian and against the defamation almost a secret service war against WikiLeaks is a great thing, and it's enheartening to see people work like this. So, first thing, a week ago, Stella, you were in London, you were at the Strand, central London. There are the buildings of the High Courts, and there was another, I don't know how many court sessions there have been. Meanwhile, I would say around 10 or something like that. There was another court session. What happened there in the High Court last Monday?
Well, the first thing to point out is that Julian has been in a high-security prison, the most serious high-security prison in the UK for over 5 years, without sentence, without conviction, just because the United States is trying to extradite him to face charges that carry a 175-year sentence. So for 5 years, since he was basically abducted from the Ecuadorian embassy, he has been fighting in the courts, and this process has gone through the courts. And on last Monday, we were at a stage of potential sudden death, in the sense that if he had lost a week ago, it would have meant that he had no further appeal avenues in the UK, and the only thing to stop an extradition would then have been the European Court of Human Rights. But what happened was he won. He won on two interrelated points that actually go to the heart of the legal attack on him, which is an attack on journalism itself. The British courts basically rejected US so-called assurances a diplomatic note from the US government. The courts had asked for an assurance that Julian would be able to rely on the First Amendment at trial in the United States, and the United States replied saying he can seek to rely on the First Amendment, and anyone with a decent command of the English language understands the difference between an assurance to rely on the First Amendment and an assurance that he can seek to rely on the First Amendment. So basically the courts were not happy with this.
Maybe you should say that First Amendment is the First Amendment of the US Constitution, where the freedom of speech, freedom of opinion is enshrined.
So basically the First Amendment is the equivalent of Article 10, freedom of expression in the UK, in the European Convention of Human Rights. It is the protection mechanism in the United States, and not only that, it's baked into their constitution. And the United States historically has very strong, or the strongest in the world. What happens? Well, over 40 law professors in the United States have written to the Biden administration saying that Julian's case is an existential threat to the First Amendment. Why? Because it's unprecedented what they have done. They've used an act from 1917 during the First World War. It was passed extremely broad. It's never been used in relation to publishing in news gathering. It has been used against whistleblowers in the past, especially during the Obama administration. But it's the very first time that it was used against a publisher. And the reason why this should be of concern to everyone in Germany and in Europe is that the United States is using its secrecy laws extraterritorially, basically piercing European sovereignty and saying everyone in this room is potentially caught by the Espionage Act. It's a US law, but they're saying it has extraterritorial effect. And not only that, because Julian is an Australian citizen, he's not American, he has nothing to do with the United States, and he was not in the United States at the time of these publications. The United States is arguing in the extradition that Julian does not have access to constitutional protections of the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of the press.
Yeah. Andy, what do you think? Why is the US government pursuing Julian so persistently? I mean, there was the surveillance in the Ecuadorian embassy. There other people around him have been surveyed and made strange experiences and thought that maybe secret services are acting around them. Why is that so? Why is he such a bad guy in the eyes of the US government?
Well, until 2016, we had relatively, voice of reason with Barack Obama basically seeing the New York Times problem, meaning that they saw the issue that Julian Assange, as a publisher and journalist, could hardly be persecuted for publishing activities, because then they would also have to actually go after the New York Times and others. However, the embarrassing factor of the WikiLeaks publications seems to have motivated some of the, I don't want to call it the deep state, we can call it the permanent government or the longer lasting elements of the administration, or there's all kinds of nice words for those guys acting in the intelligence and the military who just didn't like the fact that they had been asked about war crimes, participation in war crimes, about corruption, all kinds of stuff that WikiLeaks revealed. And so we're having a bit of a complicated mess right now, where Joe Biden, if we like him or not, is maybe relatively sanely trying to navigate between the hardcore elements of the military and the intelligence who want to see Julian hanging on the highest tree. Then on the other side, if we forecast what will happen on that side of the Atlantic, we're looking at Trump, who's considering putting Mike Pompeo back into service. And Mike Pompeo, the former head of CIA, was actually the person who triggered the whole investigation, the surveillance, and so on. So Mike Pompeo, in a way, is, in a person, our problem in Julian's case. And so there is an attempt of the Australian government to basically call their American friends to reason, but it's not easy. I think if we would look at this from a sane and sober European table, it's very easy. This is protected activities of publishing. But in this very polarized world, it becomes more difficult even. And Julian's publications back then, I mean, WikiLeaks publications of the cables, the Iraq, the Afghan war log, the stuff on Gitmo and so on, back then already brought up some polarization. And now with all the wars going on, it's even more difficult for the US government to be navigating among constitutional values. But that's the thing that is simply unacceptable, that they're trying to punish him under US laws, but do not grant him the rights of the US Constitution. That's like partial exposure of the laws as it pleases them. And that's something that even the British court seems to see now as something that's just not right.
Stella, do you want to add something? Why is Julian so hated by the American Secret Services and by the DOJ and other institutions?
Well, I'd say he's hated by some sectors within the US establishment. That's certainly true. But he's also has a lot of support within the United States. And a lot of people within the Biden administration see that this case is a total folly. And it's been like that throughout the different administrations. During the Obama administration, as Andy mentioned, the DOJ decided not to prosecute Julian in relation to the Chelsea Manning leaks, because perhaps we should just mention, as I'm sure most of you are aware, Julian is being prosecuted over the Chelsea Manning leaks. This is the disclosure of information of the highest public interest about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the prison camp in Guantanamo Bay, the collateral murder release, which included the rules of engagement and the diplomatic cables. And these evidenced war crimes, the practice of torture, assassination squads, and the complicity of European nations in those grave breaches of international law, and also US interference, including here in Germany, in relation to US interference in investigations into those CIA renditions and tortures, specifically in relation to the case of a German national called Khalid al-Masri, who was abducted and tortured and was able to win his case at the European Court of Human Rights. He was a totally innocent man who was just kidnapped and tortured. So that is the big picture, that Julian is being prosecuted for information of the highest journalistic public interest value. And of course, he embarrassed all sorts of people with power. And throughout the different administrations, he's embarrassed the Democrats, he's embarrassed the Republicans, and he's really embarrassed the surveillance state and the warring factions of the security state to such a degree that during the Trump administration, the CIA, which was headed by Mike Pompeo at the time, had plans to kidnap and even assassinate him when he was inside the embassy. There were discussions at the highest level of the Trump administration inside the White House with the president about assassinating Julian. And Mike Pompeo, head of the CIA at the time, had asked his agents to come up with what were called sketches or options about how to kidnap and assassinate him. So these sectors exist, and they continue to exist throughout the administrations. But there's also the other parts of the administration who hear the law professors when they're saying, the constitutional law professors who are saying this case is an existential threat to our most basic constitutional protection to free speech. And by the way, on that point of the assassination plot, the British courts actually made a ruling. We tried to introduce the evidence about the assassination plot as part of the extradition proceedings. And the court said, we find the reports about the assassination credible. But then they did something truly extraordinary. So they say, assassinate, yes, we believe you that the Trump administration was in fact plotting to murder Assange. However, once the United States issued an extradition request for Assange, the underlying rationale for more extreme measures, in parenthesis, kidnapping or assassination, that underlying rationale fell away. And these two judges, they put this in black and white. You don't have to be a high court judge to realize how abhorrent such a ruling is, that you are still willing to send a person to the country that has plotted to assassinate him. And you say, yes, they were actually plotting to assassinate him, but then they tried to get him legally, so it's fine.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. Stella, let's have a short look in the future. After Monday's decision by the High Court, there will be another appeal by the High Court. Is it clear when it will happen and what it will be about?
We'll find out soon, because the courts and the parties are in the process of figuring out their schedules, and then there will be a scheduling of a hearing at the High Court in London. And then there will be a full hearing in relation to these points about Julian's ability to, or non-ability to rely on the First Amendment at trial in the United States. So in the coming months, we don't have a date yet, but I think we'll probably find out this week.
So, and we should maybe tell once again, he's more than 5 years now at the Belmarsh High Security Prison. He was 6.5 years in the Ecuadorian embassy, which was quite luxurious for a prison, but it was still a prison. So that means now it's more than 11 years that he's robbed of his freedom.
Actually, it's longer. I mean, it's the 7th of December 2010 was the day when he lost his freedom.
Right.
Then he was 10 days in prison, 1.5 years under house arrest under extremely restrictive conditions, and then 6.5 years inside the embassy. But the embassy period was an eternity, but we're nearing the same amount of time in prison as the embassy. And when I met Julian, he was 39. He's 52 now. Yeah. You know, the last one he was in Berlin, he was in his 30s.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe one small point. I mean, what we're seeing is Julian has been killed by administration. It's not even clear how it would go if he would be extradited to the US. But my question to the audience is, will you please ask Ms. Biersbock this evening, who in her election campaign said that she would do everything for Julian Assange, and since she's the elected foreign minister of this country, has done nothing and not said a single word about Julian. Will you please ask her to address the issue at the highest levels of her, international cooperation partners? Some other governments do that. Thank you. I mean, just to have it said, this situation since at least 5 years is not only for Julian and for you a nightmare. I can say that from the foundation perspective, conducting and getting engaged in the collection of funds and payments of about 10 legal teams in 8 countries plus campaign people is a bit of a nightmare. And we're learning a lot about the interplay between governments and elected people and what they say once they're elected, not only in Germany. But it's clearly that every day counts in this game. So I'm no more that confident that the legal system will solve this issue. As a lawyer, you might have originally had also these ideas. I think that only public pressure, especially on the US administration, by those governments who declare themselves civilized and based on human rights actings, will hopefully help.
For me, the extraordinary thing about the foreign minister here in Germany is that you've already had the chancellor, Olaf Scholz, a few weeks ago, he said that Julian should not be extradited to the United States. So I don't know what's holding her back. I'd like to ask her. I'm going to try to hang around and see if she'll greet me this time.
Another question about the law or the legal status of Julian and his possibilities. In the case, his appeal will be turned down by the High Court. There's the European level. What can be done legally on the European level to protect him from an extradition?
Well, in practice, the European Court of Human Rights, there are two parallel kind of processes. There's one that Julian would apply for the entire handling of the case by the UK. He would ask the European Court to review on a large number of grounds, because it's been, frankly, a disgrace. But a separate process is the Rule 39 order, which is an emergency order. You ask the court to issue an order to the British government, basically, to stop the process of extradition. Because if Julian were to lose, if he had lost on Monday, there was nothing that could stop the extradition at that point, except for, if the UK government decided to do something, which clearly they're not minded to do, they wouldn't do. So the only hope would have been this Rule 39 order, which is very fast. It's only granted in extremely rare occasions where there's an immediate risk of irreparable harm. Of course, in this case, we have an immediate risk of irreparable harm. I'm confident that the European Court of Human Rights would, in fact, issue such an order because of the nature of this case and the stakes. And in fact, actually, I think it's important that the stakes have been ignored, and we've been kind of sold over the years that this is a process. And even inside the word process, it implies some kind of legitimacy. But there is no legitimacy in keeping a journalist in prison for over 5 years without conviction, and in relation to publishing information that was of the highest public importance, exposing the country that's trying to extradite him committing crimes.
Just to make things slightly more practical, in 2014, some staffers of WikiLeaks discussed here on a panel also about Julian, and what they said became part of the indictment. So it's not only
Not
about
what they said.
Excuse me?
It was precisely, sorry, just to clarify. It was here in Republica in 2014, and this was like in the wake of the Snowden revelations. Republica had like a little subset of the conference about surveillance and what have we learned, what does this mean? And this part of the conference was in fact sponsored by a government, I can't remember the name, a government department about public education and debate. And so this debate was included in the indictment in a completely false claim. So we wanted to show you the video to contrast the wording of the indictment with the video, but there wasn't enough time, and I'm happy to share it afterwards so you can contrast. Basically, what the indictment claimed was that Sarah Harrison, who was sitting here, the indictment claimed that WikiLeaks was trying to recruit hackers into giving information. You look at the video, and what she's talking about is about the value of archives in investigative journalism, and specifically of the +D archive publication in WikiLeaks, which was the diplomatic cables plus other State Department cables that had been disclosed by the State Department itself via Freedom of Information Act requests. And the State Department basically released this information, but made it completely unsearchable. And so the +D archive, what it did was allow the largest library of US diplomacy that was already in the public domain to be put in a larger collection. And of course, this allows deep investigation and search for researchers, for journalists, and so on. She said that, and then they twisted it into a criminal act that has nothing to do with what she was saying. But this is why it's so important to understand that this case implicates Germany, everyone at Republica, everyone that's speaking at Republica, like, can maybe, anyone can be subject to this kind of overreach to try to shut down political speech. Because think about it, that was a debate that was funded by the German government for open public discussion about surveillance. And then it's made its way all the way into the indictment against Julian.
Yeah, you must say that this indictment, with summing up with a maximum sentence of 175 years, is quite phony. I mean, I've read during 40 years in journalism, I've read a lot of indictments, but it's based on very dubious testimonies. So it's a scandal by itself. But let me make one point. I've been in journalism since more than 40 years, and I don't understand why not every single journalist in this world is supporting actively Julian, because it's about the right to work with secret government documents. It's about the right to reveal crimes, war crimes, and other crimes. And that's the most noble thing journalists can do. I mean, writing about movies is something else, and it's fine. But the basic task of journalists is investigative journalism, to control governments and big corporations. And so every journalist, and may he be a citizen of Greece or whichever country, is threatened by the American approach to put journalists in front of courts because of espionage, because of a law from 1917. And that is why I always plead to fellow journalists, we have to do something. We have this guy to get them out of prison. We have to fight for our rights to do proper journalism. Well, it has always been said, and I think there's some truth in it, that the case Julian Assange is not a legal battle. Mostly it's a political case, it's a political question. So I was quite alarmed, or I was surprised when the British government announced that they're going to have elections for the Commons beginning of July, and I thought, maybe a Labour government could think differently about Julian Assange. and could just, stop the extradition, which was ordered by Priti Patel, a right-wing Tory minister. How do you see that? You're sitting in London, and is that a political chance for Julian to get out of jail?
Well, elections are always a political opportunity because things become uncertain. I think one of the things that has really worked against Julian over these past 14 years since the Chelsea Manning publications is that throughout that time, throughout the past 14 years, there's been a conservative government in the United Kingdom. And yes, we've had many prime ministers, but it's all been conservative government. So the elections are on the 4th of July, and everything indicates that Labour will win, which on the face of it could be an opportunity, but there's a complication. And that complication is that the leader of the Labour Party is implicated in Julian's persecution. And this is before he was part of the Labour Party, when he was the head of the Crown Prosecution Service back in 2010. We have documents that have been disclosed, and there's a book by Stefania Marizzi that compiles hundreds and hundreds of emails between the United Kingdom and Sweden, and she's also getting them from emails from the United States. And basically what this shows is that the initial, up until Julian's arrest, the United Kingdom was playing an active role in Julian's legal limbo, let's put it. So in 2010, it was telling Sweden not to question Julian, even though this was what the standard thing of doing is to travel around the European area and question people, especially when they haven't been charged. Julian, of course, was never charged in Sweden throughout those 9 years. When Sweden moved to drop the preliminary investigation in Sweden, the UK, under Keir Starmer, the current leader of the Labour Party, told the Swedish authorities not to drop the case, and they said, literally, don't you dare get cold feet. This is in an email that's in Stefania Marizzi's book, and so on. And during this time, also Keir Starmer traveled to Washington, D.C. on 3 occasions, and the Crown Prosecution Service has destroyed all records of his meetings during those 3 visits to Washington, D.C. as head of the Crown Prosecution Service. On top of it, thousands of emails from the unit that was in charge of Julian's case under Keir Starmer destroyed their records as well. And this is a subject of potentially a parliamentary inquiry in the UK. As of last week, there's been a request by an MP to open a parliamentary inquiry into the illegal destruction of the documents pertaining to Julian, the UK end of the handling of Julian's case in 2010 to 2015. So this is why I say that the problem we have is, and I don't want to presume that Labour will not take a different position, but there are complications because many of the same people who put Julian in this position of persecution are implicated in decision-making positions, and this may continue after the election as well.
So you can't make us any hope that a change of government in Britain would turn around the whole situation, but
maybe.
Let's look to other countries. I'm asking myself and asking you, which country, which government has influence on the US government? First comes to my mind Australia. Julian is an Australian citizen, was born there, grew there up in Australia, and the Australian government traditionally has been very close to the US government, and they sent soldiers to Vietnam and everything. So and how is the political atmosphere in Australia at the moment? I mean, is Julian Assange, is it an issue, a public issue, or is it not?
It's a huge public issue. The Australian government, this current Australian government, has actually taken a position on Julian's release. And this is a contrast to the previous governments who had basically facilitated his imprisonment and abandoned him. And if you're in a political case and your government doesn't back you, you're toast, basically. So the shift has come with the Australian government's calling for Julian's release increasingly over time. The current Prime Minister, when he was running, he said he wanted Julian to be released. Actually, this is maybe an interesting contrast point with the Foreign Minister here. He actually, once he was elected, he continued to call for Julian's release, and in fact resonated very strongly with the Australian population, because Julian has enormous support from the Australian public. Polls show that between 80 and 90% of Australians want Julian to be able to be free and be able to come back to Australia. And it's not just the ruling party, but also the opposition. On Valentine's Day this year, a resolution passed in the Australian Parliament where over 2/3 of the Parliament called for Julian to be released. So there's just across-the-board support in Australia, huge political support, and also the politicians there understand that the popular support exists, and that's what they expect from their politicians. And that's why, because of the public support, the popular support has translated into political action. But in terms of who has influence over the US government, I mean, Germany has influence over the US government. They need Germany just like they need Australia. And of course, Germany has a role of leadership within the European Union. I was meeting with a minister of another European country just on Friday, and I was able to say, actually, Olaf Scholz has said Julian should not be extradited. You know, you could do something similar. You could say something, but he's already said it, and you know, I'm speaking to you, and you have the same sentiment. Like, there's no political risk. Scholz has already said it. So Germany has a role, and of course, the United States needs its allies, especially in the geopolitical context that we are all aware of, and where Germany plays a pivotal role as an ally in a kind of a current situation where the international unity is crumbling. I mean, it's pretty obvious. So Germany, of course, has a heavy weight, and one shouldn't underestimate the amount of influence. When you speak to Americans, they think Germany has weight. I think maybe Germany thinks it doesn't have weight, but the Americans certainly think so.
Tricky. I mean, I hear you that Germany has, within the circumstances, some influences. What I'm wondering is the chilling effect that the prosecution has also has already an impact on journalism, and that's the trouble. That, like, those governments who let it happen participate in a way of making it clear that the truth and radical journalism, investigative journalism, and transparency of governmental affairs is no more wished, right? It's kind of an atmosphere. And I think that at least the current government, while Scholz has said some good things, Ms. Baerbock, not a single word. So there is some kind of a very cautious, not offending the US in this country as well as to other countries. And I mean, the country has a history where we could ask ourselves some decades ago, wouldn't whistleblowers have changed it? But it's not only whistleblowers, it's also the publicists, the journalists who actually bring those stuff to light. We currently have other leaks where whistleblowers talked about artificial intelligence being used in automatic target identification and killing in the Middle East. And the whistleblowers talked about it for some days. The Guardian dropped one article. One was in an Israeli newspaper, and now it disappeared because the whistleblowers are dead silence, and the journalists have been threatened as well. So we are in an atmosphere where going after journalists and going after like anyone who's offending the big military players is at risk. So I'm already seeing this as a problematic kind of tension that Julian's case has on everything else, like we let it happen. So, and I'm not sure how this continues, independent of, let's say Julian gets out tomorrow, still, he was like punished already for years and years, and it's clearly, for me, the sign is don't try this, like don't try to bring light into the darkness of governmental actings. That's bad. And I'm even wondering, I personally was involved in Snowden publications like 2013. I'm not sure how this would go today in this very polarized environment with Russia and China and so on, if you wouldn't be straightforward accused of weakening your allies' intelligence or something. So this is bad, and I'm not seeing the light at the end of the tunnel yet. I hope that you guys can ask Baerbock about it and make her at least tell us what she will do. So.
I mean, you said this is bad and that is bad.
Yeah, sorry.
When I got you right, the upcoming elections in the United States,
oh yeah, it gets worse.
It would be much better for Julian if Joe Biden would win it again, because the people around Trump, the former CIA people, would continue with this relentless, harsh line against Julian, and Biden at least murmured somehow, we're considering it, when he was asked if they were thinking about ending the persecution of Julian. So should we hope for Biden in November?
I'm sorry, I'm the wrong person to be optimistic about the US government doing the right thing, but maybe there's someone out there who would say that. I mean, this is really a tough one. Joe Biden doesn't give me the impression that he speaks for us, the people, or for transparency of governmental affairs, or for like human rights. Like that would be a start. But maybe that's too much to expect from a US president.
Well, the Biden administration, I mean, if you look objectively where we are now, last week Julian actually won on a very important point that goes to the heart of this case, whether he'll even be able to raise the First Amendment, right? And the British courts appear to be taking that seriously, and they said in the hearing on Monday, they said, given the stakes, we're not going to stop anyone from speaking. I said that when the US lawyer was objecting to the defense being able to develop their arguments. Given the stakes, that's the first time we've actually heard an acknowledgement by the British courts that actually the stakes couldn't be higher. And so in terms of like where we are now versus 8 days ago, Julian is in a much stronger position in relation to this extradition. And you also have the Biden administration, who, as Michael said, Biden himself said, we're considering it when he was asked about dropping Julian's case. Dropping it, you know? And of course, dropping the case is what the Biden administration should have done from day one. And in fact, one of the outgoing prosecutors at the end of the Trump administration, he was working on the case, and then he went into private practice, and he did like an exit interview as he was leaving the Department of Justice. And he said, you know, new administration, they might look at this case and they might take a completely different position. He said this in a public interview. And that's like signaling. And of course, Biden should have, from day one, because this was a Trump administration prosecution. Yeah. This indictment is from 2018. And it came as, if you read Mike Pompeo's book, by the way, because he was trying to become president and then no one likes him, but they are afraid of him. And no one bought the book. But anyway, if you read that book, he takes credit for Julian's imprisonment. And he says that he was pushing for it. He was pushing to bring down Julian, and there was even public statements and so on, whole speeches about how he was going to bring down Julian when he was the head of the CIA. And as I said, actually, he had plans to even murder him. Okay, so this indictment that is 5 years into the extradition process in the UK, and which Foreign Minister Baerbock can't bring herself to say anything about. This is the product of, it's the child of the worst aspects of the Trump administration. It's the most dangerous and lasting legacy of the Trump administration. And Biden has kept it going. The Biden administration has kept it going through almost its entire first term. Like, if they're considering dropping it, it's like, this is well past the time when you should have started considering dropping it. They should have dropped it years and years ago. They've had everyone telling them, it's, from the Washington Post to the New York Times, to the Committee to Protect Journalists, to Reporters Without Borders, and Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, you name it, the United Nations. I mean, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, the previous one, Niels Meltzer, he wrote a book, which, if you haven't read it, it's really important to understand the years of persecution that led to this point, and the collusion between the states involved. It's been a decade and a half of persecution of different types, right? The legal case is just one. There was a banking blockade in 2010. The first time there was a banking blockade, PayPal, Bank of America, Visa, MasterCard, etc., coming together to shut off WikiLeaks donations. Because, of course, WikiLeaks survives off donations. So shut off the money flow from donors. And the average donation was like $20. They came together to shut it off, and it was the first time. That was that was just one aspect of the attack on WikiLeaks. Banking, reputational, with all the smears there have been, which is material for another 5-hour discussion. And the legal one is just one aspect, but of course it's the one that has deprived Julian of his liberty for many years, and that risks him never seeing the light of day again.
Thanks, Stella. Please, if you have any questions, ask them to Stella and/or Andy, please.
Wait, can you get a microphone or something? I don't know.
No, come.
And here, I'll speak loud. Because
so the question was about Julian's health and how he reacted to the news last week. Well, his health is in bad condition. He wasn't able to attend the court hearing itself. He had permission to, but he didn't. As you know, probably, he had a minor stroke in October 2022. He's been in a 6 square meter cell for 5 years plus, isolated for over 20, 21, 22, sometimes 23 hours a day, no internet. This is an extremely harsh environment in which when he's able to exercise, he's taken to the yard for up to an hour, and it's a cement area, and it's got mesh overhead. It's it's not a park, you know, it's a cement space. And Belmarsh, which is, as I said, extremely harsh prison, has all these additional restrictions, like he's able to call me, but we can only speak 10 minutes at a time. This is when you think about it, it's a really, really severe and disproportionate restriction on your ability to communicate with the outside world. Why? Why can we only speak for 10 minutes at a time? It just cuts off like that, and then we have to wait to be able to speak again. And you can't really develop a conversation in any depth like that. It just cuts off, and then you wait, and then again. And he gets 2 visits a week, which is a lifeline, but obviously for most of the time he's alone in his cell. I mean, right now, just picture him. I can tell you exactly where he is. He's in his cell. At 4 o'clock every day, the door's shut for good. There's no going out. And when he goes out, before that, you can go for 5 minutes to go to the medical hatch and get your medication, go back to your cell, or you go and you get your lunch, then you go back to your cell, because everyone eats inside their cell, not out of choice. That's how Belmarsh does it. Isolation, 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 year in, year out, for over 5 years now. So, of course, his health is in decline. We don't know the full extent of what his state of health is, and psychological health. We simply don't know, and we live in fear that he could have a catastrophic health episode while he's in Belmarsh. And it's not like there's good or immediate access to healthcare there. Like, if something happens to you alone in your cell, you'd better get to that alarm bell, right? Quick. So obviously this is an ongoing high risk to his life every day. In terms of his reaction, well, in the lead up to the hearing, because it was what I called like sudden death, I was using a kind of a sports analogy there, but if he had lost, then, you know, we simply didn't know. People have been extradited within 24 hours of a final decision, and that's where we were at. That could have happened. And so he was having trouble sleeping, having trouble concentrating. You know, it was extremely stressful, the kind of pressure that you're under with this kind of uncertainty, and where you don't know if tomorrow you're going to be on a plane to the United States and everything changes, you know. And so I spoke to him immediately after, and obviously he was relieved. But that kind of strain has a intense effect. And for example, over the weekend, he was ill. He had a fever. I think his like immune system crashed out of the stress of it all. He's past the fever, so there's that. But I mean, of course, it's taking an enormous strain on him.
Thanks. Any questions, please? Yep.
Oh.
Sorry. Thanks for that question. That was exactly the question I wanted to ask there now, so please.
Yeah, I mean, go speak to Baerbock and you know, like, politicians are afraid of losing their voters. Like, they actually do care what makes a difference in people's estimation and their political survival, of course. But in terms of Julian's case, obviously there are costs to the campaign, to the legal teams. It's an enormous fight. The United States has poured in millions and millions of dollars into persecuting Julian over the years, and we're putting up a fight, you know? We're putting up a decent fight, but we need ongoing support. There's that. The Valholland Foundation accepts tax-deductible donations in Germany and the rest of Europe. I think the really important thing is to speak to your friends, your colleagues, your family, read on this case, follow the case. The public perception of this case is what can free Julian. That's the nature of political cases. And it's also, you know, that this case is not just about Julian. Saving Julian is, of course, the highest priority, and it's an attack on him. But it's an attack on him, yes, to silence him, to silence WikiLeaks and so on, but it's actually a bullying method on other journalists and ultimately on the public's right to know. Because if you don't have journalists who are willing to publish and who are secure in their ability to publish the truth and to offend those in power, then you end up with an ignorant public. And I think this is the ultimate goal, to keep the public ignorant. Julian is the method through which they get an ignorant public, because it has a chilling effect, and it has also a disproportionate effect in terms of setting a new standard. Like, Julian's case is so high profile. Julian is so high profile. The publications he's being persecuted in relation to could not be more important. Like, you're talking about the killing of tens of thousands of civilians, about torture, about complicity in torture, about assassination squads. Like, you know, this firmly belongs in the public domain, and Julian is in prison because of it. And so journalists around the world are now in a more vulnerable position because their governments say, well, you know, they're doing it to Assange. This is the new normal. And when, you know, when Western or European institutions go and say, talk about press freedom or don't persecute dissidents, don't put your journalists in prison, they go, huh? What about Assange? Like, you know, so everyone becomes more vulnerable and more exposed to persecution as long as Julian is in prison. That has to be reversed.
Yeah. Also, vielleicht noch 2 Worte. Wir sammeln natürlich ganz konkret Spenden unter wauland.de, haben allerdings gerade keine Gemeinnützigkeit wegen kleinen Missverständnissen. Mal sehen. Und zweitens, ich denke, sorry, I'm German.
Yeah, I didn't know if you're speaking to me.
What's kind of, what I think what changed for me the whole thing is that, you know, the so-called Western world used to be freedom, human rights, and those evil forces out there, we would have to beat the shit out of them because they wouldn't have the human rights. Now, these arguments are kind of off the table. And I would go to the extent that the German government, at least in the foreign policy sector, becomes complicit to threatening of journalists, to the persecution of Julian Assange, by letting it happen. So this is something that Baerbock needs to hear, I think, in multiple voices, that it's just not okay to pretend to be on the right side of history, hand in hand with a superpower that just abuses their power to go after those who ask them for their accountability. So, thank you.
Thank you for coming, for listening. I hope very much that we won't sit here in 5 years' time, or even in 10 years' time, and talk about freedom for Julian Assange. It has to be much quicker. Somewhere we have to get the optimism to
let's
continue.
aim for having him here next year.
And we have a really good little group in Berlin. They do show movies about Julian on a regular basis. They're meet for Mahnwache. I don't know whether it's in English, Mahnwache at the American embassy. And so there are people all over the world active for Julian, and we shouldn't stop with that. And I thank you very much, Andy and Stella, for coming here. And we're going to see, and we won't take it.